All right, for our lecture, we're going to get into some of the fun stuff. Heads are going to roll today. I've been looking forward to this lecture for the entirety of the course. I'll just say that. In fact, if I could have it in my way, we'd just start right here. We're going to talk about three very important revolutions that took place in the 18th century. Now, there were many revolutions that we won't get to discuss in as much detail, such as those led by Simón Bolívar in South America and the Mexican independence from Spain in 1821. Now, we are going to talk about Mexico's independence, but that won't come until, believe it or not, the World War I lecture, if we can get that far. However, today, we're going to be talking about three of the most significant revolutions in world history. And again, this is one of those situations where we could have entire courses or even a few weeks dedicated to each of these revolutions. But we're going to combine them, in part because the textbook does, but more so because each one feeds into the other. It's not like a set of dominoes where one falls and the others go with it. Each one of these, the American, French, and Haitian revolutions, can't be understood in their entirety without at least a discussion of the others. And none of these revolutions happened in a vacuum. This lecture is going to look at the background and philosophical ideas floating around that are behind these revolutions. Episode 2, or Lecture 2, will be looking at the American Revolution. In Episode 3, we're going to make heads roll with the French Revolution. And then the final part will be about the Haitian Revolution. And also pay attention to the Blackboard page, as I have posted the link to the documentary about Toussaint Louverture, as well as given you a sort of a viewing guide or a worksheet to work on to help you kind of pay attention and focus on some important aspects of the revolution. This is going to kind of take the part of participation this week, and it is going to be due on Monday. So watch the documentary. It's from some guy's YouTube. I wanted to get it through our library, but as you can understand, that's not possible right now. Well, let's go ahead and get started with the intellectual background. The Enlightenment is sometimes called the Age of Reason. It's built off of the scientific revolution, the idea being, instead of letting the church answer all of life's questions, the Enlightenment thinkers tried to apply the methods and questions of scientific inquiry to the study of human society. In doing so, these philosophers made people critical of any efforts to extend the power of kings and the monarchy, questioned the imposition of new taxes, and raised questions about individual rights. We'll briefly discuss three of the main philosophers here, but just know that there are dozens of them, and they are all speaking to and around each other's ideas in exchanges, in letters and salons, and even across oceans. John Locke is sometimes thought of as the father of the Enlightenment. In 1690, Locke argued that governments were created to protect the individual rights of life, liberty, and property, words that might sound familiar if you've read the Constitution. And the people had the right to rebel when a monarch violated these natural rights. While John Locke emphasized the individual, one of his intellectual inheritors, the French-Swiss intellectual Jean-Jacques Rousseau, focused on the collective society. In his most influential work, The Social Contract, published in 1762, Rousseau asserted that the will of the people was sacred, and that the legitimacy of monarchs depended on the consent of the governed. Voltaire only gets sort of a passing mention in the textbook, but he's going to advocate for, among other rights, the freedom of religion, religious toleration, and thus the separation of church and state. Voltaire defended people who he believed were being persecuted on account of their religion. If we recall, the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Reformation, those set off a lot of violent disagreement and persecution. That was still going on in Voltaire's time in the 18th century. And one thing to point out, as sort of an aside, Voltaire briefly met Benjamin Franklin at a meeting of the French Academy of Sciences in 1778, the last year of Voltaire's life. Voltaire wasn't really a proponent of democracy, but believed that enlightened monarchs could hold the key to political and economic reform. While these ideas might seem like they were sort of floating around above everyone's heads, something for the elites to talk about, Enlightenment ideas were being spread in many different ways, and not just among the aristocracy. Women were instrumental in the dissemination of these new ideas. In England, large numbers of educated, middle-class women purchased and discussed books and pamphlets. Mary Wollstonecraft, the mother of Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, wrote her own treatise about the rights of women in 1792. In Paris, the elite women made their homes the centers of debates. In these salons, philosophers, social critics, artists, and the elite came together to discuss and debate these ideas. The intellectual ferment of the era deeply influenced the expanding middle class, who were eager consumers of the widely available books and inexpensive newspapers and journals. Coffee houses, tea shops, and taverns became locations to discuss these works to audiences that were not part of the literate community. In port cities, these ideas spread back and forth between colonists, sailors, merchants, and enslaved people. These informal networks were crucial in spreading news and gossip along with these philosophies. While there are these philosophical debates going on that will influence these revolutions, there are also real situations on the ground that people and governments will have to confront. This can be most easily seen and demonstrated by looking at the 7 Years' War. Now, it's called the 7 Years' War in Europe. In the United States, we generally call it the French and Indian War, because the British fought against the French and most of the Native American tribes in the eastern part of the continent. That's not to say the British didn't have native allies, but it was mostly the Iroquois Confederacy, who were cheesed off at the French already. The war begins in part due to a young Virginia colonel in the British militia, George Washington. His diplomatic mission ambushed a French encampment of soldiers. What started as a North American affair snowballed into a world war, with Prussia, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, Russia, and even the Mughal Empire joining in the fighting. Starting a world war, that George Washington's never going to amount to anything. When all was said and done, in terms of the American continent, the British won the war, and the peace was established in the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Now, this is going to be important to note. This is just one of many treaties of Paris, and it's not even the only one in the lecture, so dates actually matter here. So, Treaty of Paris, 1763, ends the 7 Years' War. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 did two big things. One, it kicked the French off of the North American continent. Britain basically got all of the land to the Mississippi River, plus Canada, and Spain got the Louisiana Territory west of the Mississippi River. Now, take a look at the map to see how this kind of makes sense. Look at how big the Spanish claims are. That's huge. Now, we can't forget that while Europeans are claiming possession, of course, there are Native American nations all over this continent. The French basically gave up all of their territorial claims in North America and the Caribbean, with one major exception. See the little purple spot there? That's Saint-Domingue, or what we now call Haiti, France's most economically significant colony. Guess what the enslaved people are producing for the French? Sugar. The war also leaves these countries deep in debt, but for now we want to focus on the English being deep in debt. They're going to need to come up with a way to pay off the war debt, and they will turn to the colonies. But the British are also looking to the future. There was a strong possibility that British colonists moving west could create armed conflict with the Native Americans who had just been defeated, and also those who had temporarily allied themselves with the British to get the French off their backs. Already burdened with war debts, Britain desperately wanted to avoid additional expenditures for frontier defense. Thus, the king issued the Proclamation of 1763, which effectively banned white settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, how do you think that went down with the British colonists who are finding good farmland hard to find after they've exhausted the soil? And how do you think people who are speculating on that land are going to take that proclamation? Not great. So that's strike one against the king, but the colonists' real beef was against the British Parliament, who began to try to recoup the war debt by taxing the colonies that started the war in the first place. And that's where we'll pick up with Lecture 2. Stay tuned for the American Revolution. Ever heard of it?